It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, book review. So I'll give some background on this book if you're not familiar with it. It Can't Happen Here was published in 1935. And the premise of the book is a fictional book, but in the book it describes how there's a fictional fascist takeover of the United States. Now, as you can imagine, like in the 1930s, this is where fascists were kind of taking over several countries in Europe, right? Germany, Spain, Italy, I think the parts of the Balkans were also being taken over by fascists. So people at the time were kind of very concerned about what was happening, but there was also, of course, the sense that, well, of course, fascism can't happen here in the United States. And that's the irony of the title, as if you needed me to spell it out for you. Yeah, It Can't Happen Here is kind of arguing that, yes, under certain circumstances, maybe it could happen here. So the book being written in the 1930s is kind of, depending on your point of view, it's either like a timepiece of kind of the types of things that people were concerned about during the 1930s, or it's like, you know, kind of 1984, kind of one of those books that kind of never really goes out of style and is always kind of an ominous warning about a possible future. And it's the latter interpretation that has caused this book to kind of resurge in popularity every 10 years or so. Like every now and again people kind of like get the scare or something. So I think during the Nixon days this book became popular again. Fun fact for you, if you don't remember this, in 2016, after Trump won the election, this book shot to the bestseller list again. Maybe you actually remember that being in the news. I read this book actually back in 2006 when people were comparing it to George W. Bush's administration. And I wrote a review of it at the time. This is going to be part of my scripted book review series in which I go through and read old book reviews I've written in the past and maybe add a little bit to them. So I have been wanting to read this book for like forever. One reason is it's just a classic, you know, like it's one of those classics you have to knock off of your list sooner or later. Other reason, I had read earlier that same year The Iron Heel by Jack London, which is another kind of fictional dystopian novel about a fascist takeover in the United States, and people often kind of compared it to It Can't Happen Here. And then, by the same author, Sinclair Lewis, I read Babbitt earlier that same year and really enjoyed it. Babbitt is actually a humorous book, a mostly humorous book. So the tone of it is obviously different than It Can't Happen Here, although I'll get to this a little bit later in the review, but some of that same kind of ironic humor is squeaking through a little bit in It Can't Happen Here, even though It Can't Happen Here is a much more kind of serious and depressing book. But then kind of what finally gave me the final shove to read this book is a friend of mine read it and wrote about it on his blog, which I hope he doesn't mind me quoting. He says, Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here is a fantastic book, frighteningly relevant to Bush II era life. I am so pissed I wasn't forced to read it in high school. It's a book every American should be forced to read. So yeah, again, this is 2006, so we're talking about Bush II, George W. Bush. So I got the book through interlibrary loan at last and read it, and then these are my thoughts here. It Can't Happen Here is a fictional description of a fascist takeover in the United States, written in the 1930s. The book stands partly as a timepiece of an era when many people were concerned about the spread of fascism and communism, and thus it's the same vein as 1984 or The Fountainhead. Somewhat surprisingly to me, and it can happen here, there's a lot of real-life politicians and journalists and writers who actually appear as characters in the book. I'm not quite sure how Sinclair Lewis got away with it, actually. I'm surprised he didn't get sued, given that some of these people he portrays as being kind of members of the fascist government. Although I don't know what the finer points of the libel law are. So, you know, maybe somebody who's got a legal background can educate me on this. But I'm surprised he got away with it. Yeah. Now, how much of this book is still relevant today is a matter of debate. Like any book which projects a possible future, parts of "It Can't Happen Here" end up looking naive from today's standards. Other parts are eerily accurate. Therefore, if one picks and chooses which parts of Sinclair Lewis to emphasize, you can actually make him look a lot more prognostic than he really was. For example, as my friend points out, a lot of this stuff in the book could be applied to the George W. Bush administration. And incidentally, I was writing this down in 2006, but a lot of this could also be applied to the Donald Trump administration. At the time I was writing, though, I was focused on George W. Bush. So, unlike the European fascists, the fictional fascist American president, Buzz Windrip, avoids formal ceremonies and instead uses a down-home folksy charm. He uses the appeal of religious fundamentalism and old-time values as a bait-and-switch tactic to get the American people to support his authoritarian regime. The power behind the president is a character named Lee Saracen, who is like a doppelganger for Dick Cheney, or maybe like a combination of Dick Cheney and Karl Rove. And in the fictional book, It Can't Happen Here, the president manufactures a war with Mexico, complete with faked intelligence reports. So obviously the faked intelligence reports are an analogy to Bush's war in Iraq, but the antagonism with Mexico is that's an analogy with Donald Trump. At the same time, it's interesting to see how much of this book is the opposite of George W. Bush. For example, in contrast to Bush's approach of divide and conquer, or appealing directly to his base, right? So George W. Bush kind of realized very early on that the left absolutely hated him. So he kind of got all his political power by just appealing to his base and getting his base really excited and trying to get his base to turn out for the 2004 election, which ended up working for him. In contrast to that, President Windrip actually tries to co-opt the left, and he actually runs as a Democrat running on a populist platform. Now, the first time I read this book, actually, I thought that what Sinclair Lewis was doing was kind of trying to model what had happened in Italy. Now, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, if there are any serious historians watching this, but I believe what happened in Italy is that a lot of the leftists were co-opted into the fascist party. Not all of them, but a number of prominent leftists were given positions of power in the fascist party, and the fascist party in Italy had a very populist platform, so they were able to co-opt a lot of the left. I thought that's what Sinclair Lewis was doing. I actually was reading on Wikipedia just now that actually what he was doing, apparently, according to Wikipedia, was taking a shot at Huey Long. Huey Long was a populist Democrat in the 1930s who had ambitions to become president, and some people thought he was going to usher in, and, you know, he was, yeah. I think fascism might be stretching it, but some people were worried about Huey Long's political ambition. So yeah, either way, I guess, either he's going off of the Italian model here, or he's modeling this off of Huey Long. But the bad guy in this book is actually a Democrat running on a very populist platform. And then Upton Sinclair, who's again a real-life person, he was a real-life leftist writer, ends up getting portrayed in this book as having a prominent post in Winthrop's government, Winthrop being the name of the fictional fascist president. Yeah, again, I'm surprised Sinclair Lewis didn't get sued for this, but yeah, that's what happened. Also, in the book, the soldiers who are supporting Winthrop mostly kind of come from the criminal class. Now, again, I'm speculating a little bit, but I think what Sinclair Lewis was doing is maybe going off of the Marxist interpretation of fascism. And again, someone correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but Marx didn't live to see the rise of fascism in Europe, of course, but Marx at one point predicted that when a workers' revolution becomes likely, one way that the bourgeoisie could try and save itself was the bourgeoisie might form a strategic alliance with the criminal class. I think Marx called them the lumpen proletariat, was the name for the criminal class. So, in other words, kind of the thugs, the murderers, the criminals, the bourgeoisie might just kind of pay them to kind of attack the workers. Now, I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification to say that's what happened in the 1930s. I mean, I think it was a lot more complicated than that. But I think that has been kind of the Marxist interpretation of what, at the core of it, fascism was all about. Maybe trying a little bit too hard to kind of fit that into Marx's original predictions. Or I don't know. I think that's what Sinclair Lewis was doing in this book when he's portraying most of the most of the soldiers supporting the fascist regime as coming from the criminal class. Now again, here I think this breaks down as prediction because, you know, like the Bush regime, they've certainly been guilty of a lot of criminal behavior, like they've, you know, disregarded the US Constitution and stuff like that, as is Trump, depending on who you want to compare this to. But I don't see them yet kind of actively recruiting like the thugs and the murderers and the thieves kind of from the criminal class, like the actual lumpen proletariat class. So after Winthrop, the fascist character, is elected in the book, I thought the transition to state fascism began very quickly. So within a few months after the president is elected in the book, America is in a state of fascism. And I don't know, like maybe in the 1930s, this looked more realistic than it does now. But with apologies to Sinclair Lewis, I'd say this rapid transition to fascism can't happen here. At least not the way he portrays it. I don't think the American people would stand for this kind of rapid transition into fascism. A gradual transition into fascism, that one I could see. That's the one I'd be more worried about. So the thing I'd be more worried about, for example, is one day it would be big news that the government was tapping everyone's phones without warrants, like we found out that the government was doing. And then it would be all over the news and everyone would be outraged, and then after a few months people would forget to be outraged about it, and then it would just be normal. And then a few months later we'd find out something else awful the government was doing. So like this kind of gradual erosion of liberties, that path I think is perfectly possible. In the book it can't happen here. It's like 6 months after the election to America being converted into a fascist state, and I just don't think that's realistic. Another point, like George Orwell in 1984, Sinclair Lewis spends a lot of time in the book writing graphic depictions of people getting beaten and tortured. Now, this made me feel uncomfortable. I feel like with these kind of fictional depictions of beating and torture, you know, like if it's historical, like if you're writing about the way slaves used to be beaten or something, then I'm okay with it, because that really happened, you know, and people need to know what really happened, and they need to know like how awful that real history was. If it's fictional though, it makes me a little bit more uncomfortable. And lingering on a torture scene in a fictional book, like Sinclair Lewis does occasionally, strikes me as almost a bit sadistic. But I think if Lewis were here, or George Orwell for that matter, because Orwell also kind of, you know, writes about these torture scenes in his book, I think they would argue that the entire point of that book, their books, is that fascist and authoritarian regimes are based on violence, torture, and brutality. And by the same token, I think they would argue that the surest sign that a society is slipping into fascism is a willingness to accept torture as an acceptable method of governing. One of Orwell's characters says it very well. He says, this is one of the totalitarian characters in 1984, he says, if you want a picture of the future, picture a boot stomping down on a human face forever. And it's this part of the book, I guess both books, which I think is what's most applicable to what's going on today. And today actually meaning 2006 when I originally wrote this. But you know, at the time, the Vice President of the United States was actively lobbying Congress for kind of more leniency in torture. And if Sinclair Lewis or George Orwell were alive then, or were alive today, you know, I think they would have seen this as a sign that their worst fears were coming true. Because their books are all about reminding us that when we allow torture, we've essentially just given up our humanity. One final note here is something I mentioned briefly earlier, but despite the depressing subject material of Lewis's book, his humor and wit still does shine through at different points. Now, I mentioned in my review of Babbitt that I thought if Sinclair Lewis were alive today, he'd be writing for The Simpsons, or, you know, would have written for The Simpsons in the golden age. He seems to have kind of that type of kind of sense of the absurd in his books. And parts of It Can't Happen Here are kind of thick with that kind of absurd sense of ironic satire. So that part does shine through a little bit in the book, despite its just depressing nature. All in all, if you haven't read this book yet, I'd recommend it. I mean, whatever else you might say about it, it's an interesting read. And then you can join the conversation and debate. Can it happen here? It can't happen here. How likely are we to have this? How much of this is reflected by our current government? And that's all part of the fun. I probably shouldn't use the word fun. That's all part of the intellectual engagement of a book like this. Okay, I'm going to finish here.